Without question, within the last decade, that the superhero genre has taken over in terms of popularity. And most of that comes down to the MCU, which has been running since 2008. And in that time, they have now released 26 films following on from Eternal's release a couple of days ago. And it's time to update my MCU ranking for the second time, including Eternals, from worst to best. So without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at 26th place is Thor: The Dark World. Now I'm going to keep this short and sweet for most of these. Thor: The Dark World doesn't contain any unforgivable sins, but it's just overall a dull experience. All the characters aren't that interesting, especially the villain Malekith, who is easily the most forgettable in the whole universe. But like I said, it doesn't commit any unforgivable sins, it's just overall a forgettable experience and one of the few disappointments that the MCU has produced. Coming in at 25th place is Iron Man 2. As this is the first MCU sequel, it was one which failed to live up to its predecessor, as it crumbles in attempting to set up the Avengers movie way too soon. Robert Downey Jr. is still great as Tony Stark and actually has an interesting side plot about him getting ill from his arc reactor, but the behind the scenes troubles were apparent with this film's overall quality, as there is barely any action, only about 2 big action scenes that I can recall, with once more a silly villain. So it's an important stepping stone for that Avengers film, but it's one which was way too rushed and below the MCU standard. Coming in at 24th place is Thor. Now this may be the first time that we're taken to a new world in the MCU, but the way it's executed is just so dull. These first 2 Thor movies make Thor and his surroundings such a boring place. The only real standout in terms of quirkiness was Loki, because even when he's banished to Earth, the human characters are unbearable. Kenneth Branagh's approach to this Thor film may be accurate in terms of it being a bit medieval in that sense, but it's just not that exciting. Coming in at 23rd is The Incredible Hulk. Rightly so, this one is considered to be the black sheep of the MCU. However, I feel like it gets a lot more hate than it deserves. Given that it does have a different actor to the Hulk we're used to nowadays, people kind of just tend to write it off before they even watch it. But it's actually a solid, decent little solo movie for Hulk. It's definitely a darker tone than what we're used to nowadays with the character, but it was an interesting study into him trying to maintain his composure throughout the whole duration. But the way it tells its story is executed in quite a poor way, and it made it really hard to care about the characters at all or the consequences they face. The final battle between Hulk and Abomination is one of the more underrated ones in the entire MCU, even if the CGI does look a bit rusty. Coming in at 22nd place is Black Widow. This has been a film that people were demanding ever since Scarlett Johansson's debut back in Iron Man 2. However, they did leave it a bit too late. Now I will admit the reason it may be this low as well is because we were so close to having it and then it got delayed by a whole year, and when it involves a character who's already dead and it's their backstory, so you know they don't really have much of a future, it was hard to provoke any excitement. But even so, having to delay it by a whole year pushed it down my list of anticipated film. And when it finally came to this film, I wasn't surprised with its outcome. Florence Pugh was a good addition, and that's the one thing that I look forward to seeing in the future that this film has caused. Overall, it's just kind of what we expected with Black Widow's backstory, and Taskmaster is such a cool villain in the comics and other source material that it was such a disappointment with the way the character was revealed in this film. Thought it was a waste of it. At the end of the day, it's quite a harmless film as it's a prequel. Coming in at 21st place is Captain Marvel. Now I'll admit this film does get more hate than it deserves, but it is certainly one of the weaker films in the franchise. As it takes place in the 80s, it has some nice tie-ins to things that will eventually happen in the MCU, as well as some brilliant de-aging technology for Nick Fury and Phil Coulson. Brie Larson came into this film with quite a bit of backlash from Marvel fans, or just fans in general. People kind of wrote this film off before it even happened because of her. Now, I don't let the actor outside of their work affect my opinion of the film they're in, but I must admit in this film I did find the character quite dislikable, and when that happens it's kind of hard for you to care or get invested about what they do, so that portion of the film let me down, so I wasn't as invested about what happens in the end. So at the end of the day, I didn't enjoy Captain Marvel that much, but I think it does get a bit more hate than it deserves, as it has some other cool aspects. Coming in at 20th place is the newly released Eternals. This is another film that I think gets more hate than it deserves, but then again I do understand where the criticisms do come from. First of all, this film does earn a lot of respect for me for it attempting to distance itself from the generic MCU template, which we'll talk about a lot in this video. While I can't ignore them, I can forgive some of the flaws. It really does deliver us this sense of freshness to the franchise, but as this film tries to cover the whole history of the MCU's world, it kind of fumbles the ball, especially since it has such a big cast that it can't give them all necessary development within the nearly 3-hour movie. And because of that, when there was meant to be an emotional moment, it didn't really provoke that much emotion, as I wasn't really invested in the characters. Prior to Eternals' release, it had been dubbed the worst rated film on Rotten Tomatoes, and I certainly think that's harsh. It's not the worst thing. It's not as good as it should be because it's very ambitious, but it's certainly not the worst that the franchise has seen. It's not handled to the best of its ability, but it looks visually beautiful and it adds some important things to this ever-expanding universe. As I said, it's just imbalanced with the sheer amount of content they're trying to cover in this film, whether that's from characters, plot details, or setting up things. It just doesn't come together the way Chloe Zhao would have hoped. Coming in at 19th place is Iron Man 3. I respect this film. It takes a more personal approach to an Iron Man film, with Tony Stark stripped of his checkbook, and also he's dealing with some PTSD following the events of the Avengers. So I thought that was a good approach to take this film, and overall I think it is a solid film up until its infamous Mandarin twist. Now, I don't let that film impact it to the point where it'll be bottom of this list, but it certainly was a disappointment, especially after it's setting up for one of the best MCU villains. On rewatch, knowing about the twist, I did have a good time, but I couldn't help but getting drawn into the Mandarin's performance. But then, once again, all my hopes were crushed once that twist hit, so it really does dampen the film's quality, but it's not a horrible film. Coming in at 18th place is Avengers Age of Ultron. This is by far the weakest of the 4 Avengers films, and while it's an extremely ambitious film, it just doesn't have that sense of ambition compared to the Avengers film that came before it. The film is flawed and messy, jumping over plot points, but as all Avengers films, you can still have a good time. It attempts to tackle many themes, as it feels like it has to be bigger than its predecessor, but in doing so it moves way too quickly for anything serious to form. I actually really like James Spader as Ultron, however, some of his dialogue wasn't the best, and character choices, I think Ultron was underused, and glad he's had some sort of redemption in What If. Look, it's a flawed movie, but it's fun as it delivers maybe more character dynamics than Avengers 2012, which adds some necessary development for the MCU's future. Coming in at 17th place is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Off the back of Avengers Infinity War, fans could use a small-scale film. Enter Ant-Man and the Wasp. It's not ambitious at all, it's extremely small scale, and that's not just because of the ant size features within this film, but it's a tactical, small-scale movie which succeeds in what it's trying to do. It's not as funny as its predecessor, but it still contains a lot of fun, and it just allows us to spend more time with these lovable characters. Getting to see Evangeline Lilly in the field as the Wasp is a great time as well, developing that character past her annoying self within Ant-Man 2015. The main plot and villain are the weakest aspect of the film by far. With this being so small scale, it's very forgettable, so you don't really mind that at all. It's mid-tier Marvel, but it's intending to be. It was more important for the MCU's future than you realise, given the introduction of travelling through the quantum realm. Coming in at 16th place is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Perhaps controversial, as people love this film up to the same height as the original. However, not much actually happens here. You know, the best thing about this group is them being together, their character chemistry, their interactions, and for a large portion of this film, they're all separated, and what they're all doing in their individual missions isn't really that interesting, or at least isn't that interesting with just them alone. Although saying that, Yondu, Groot, and Rocket do have a nice little adventure, and develops a more personal side to Yondu which you hadn't seen before, and makes the character more likable. The comedy's still as good as the first one, especially now that Drax is more involved. With him being such an odd character, it's hard not to laugh whenever he says something. So if the Guardians weren't separated, this would maybe be better than the first one, but as we're just left with all the characters individually, in my opinion, it's significantly weaker. Coming in at 15th place is Captain America: The First Avenger. Once again, another film which I think gets more hate than it deserves, because the origins for Captain America is very fascinating, especially given the time period it takes place. As one of the main Avengers, this leads the MCU in the right direction with his origin story, but can be frustrating with a few minor details, especially how it kind of just slides past a lot of the action in a compilation just to get to the necessary destination. For Steve Rogers himself, his origin is compelling and he is a character you instantly want to succeed. Other than that montage, the whole film is quite thought out well and quite structured in a good way, and it plays out how you'd want it, but the finale, while still good, is one of the weaker aspects of the film, as it moves way too quickly for you to take a breath and take in what's happening. Coming in at 14th place is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. As far as the planned experiments go in Phase 4, Shang-Chi can be considered a success. This film takes the infamous Marvel origin story template and rips it up for the majority of it, and delivers one of the most unique comic book movies in recent times, mixing in martial arts with themes of Chinese culture, making this a very refreshing film, as well as a beautifully shot one. Tony Leung portrays one of the MCU's best villains as the real Mandarin this time, with no stupid twist at the end. His motives are real and compelling, and you can understand why he is so broken. In terms of the action, Shang-Chi is up there with some of the best of the MCU with its hand-to-hand choreography. Simu Liu and Awkwafina have good chemistry, and Awkwafina always delivers the jokes you'd expect, but it can get a bit irritating at points, especially when it breaks the tension of a dramatic moment just to have a lame joke. And while it is such a refreshing film to the MCU, it does kind of feel a bit ruined where it has a massive CGI battle at the end out of nowhere, but I guess that is the MCU for you. So a unique film within this franchise, but maybe let down a bit by its finale. Coming in at 13th place is Spider-Man: Far From Home. Tom Holland's second solo outing as Spider-Man takes the character to Europe, which allows for some amusing action amongst famous European landmarks. The positives of its predecessor, the humor, the character chemistry, and Peter's naivety, remain and continue to deliver. Coming into this, I had my doubts about translating Mysterio into the big screen. However, he's pulled off brilliantly, especially thanks to some great acting from one of my favourite actors, Jake Gyllenhaal. You get a multi-layered performance and one of the best MCU debut performances in recent years. As this is the first MCU movie after Endgame, I like how they deal with the consequences and outcomes of that, and it's a big theme throughout this whole film's duration. As Peter's missing his mentor or his father figure Tony, it does make sense that he makes mistakes, but what doesn't make sense is Tony leaving him million-dollar tech, which is control of drones, satellites, etc. As Tony knew he was mistake prone, so as it is the main core of the story, it's hard to look past. However, it's an enjoyable Spider-Man movie. With the overuse of technology, it certainly feels like an MCU Spider-Man movie instead of just a Spider-Man movie. Coming in at 12th place is Black Panther. This is certainly more than just a superhero film in terms of displaying its culture, whether that's through the score, the costumes, or beautiful scenery making Wakanda feel like a character more than just a place. Perhaps controversial, but I consider this to be one of the most overhyped MCU projects and really respect the impact it has done, but as a film, I just feel like it isn't top 5 MCU for me. I say that only because it dragged in Oscar attention, which is the only MCU film to do so, and when you look at other superhero films which have dragged in that attention, like The Dark Knight, I just don't think it's on the same caliber. While the story is well executed and it's a good showcase of the culture underneath, it is a story we have seen before, but what makes it so unique is the environment it is in. Cast all play their characters well, especially the late Chadwick Boseman, who captivates a sense of humor as well as seriousness as he rises up the ladder of royalty. Also playing their role well was Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger. After his failed attempt at the Human Torch, he came back to Marvel and delivered one of the franchise's best and compelling villains. Whilst it got its message across in the finale, the visual effects are quite distracting, dampening the film's overall quality, as it was some of the worst CGI in the whole franchise, but doesn't take away from the impact this film caused amongst the world. Coming in at 11th place is Doctor Strange. I've just had to start off with saying that this has some of the best visuals in this entire franchise. Definitely top 3. It's not just the way they're executed, but it's how creative the shots are, combining in the illusions with the magic, of course. Like with most lead performances in this franchise, Benedict Cumberbatch nails his arrogant character as the titular character who, with others, delivers some fantastic dialogue which efficiently educates the viewer on this world that we're being introduced to. I really like the final battle, if you can call it that, because it's not about who's the more powerful, who can punch the hardest. It's about who's more clever, and as I mentioned, it's not the fists that declare the winner in this final battle, it's Doctor Strange cleverly setting Dormammu into a loop until he's forced to leave. This film does deliver some fantastic things to the franchise, however it does suffer from the MCU template where it's the classic origin story where things progress faster than they should. Besides Malika, Caecilius is one of the more forgettable villains in this franchise, which is especially disappointing given Mads Mikkelsen plays him. Coming in at 10th place is Captain America the Winter Soldier. As the third Avenger to get his sequel, Captain America's second movie does what was unfamiliar at the time and changes up the genre. Instead of a World War II action film like its predecessor, we are now with Cap in the present day, infiltrating the corrupt government, making for a more political spy drama film than a war film. Captain America the Winter Soldier is famous for its hand-to-hand combat and is absolutely brilliant, immediately drawing in whoever's watching, and they will find it hard to take their eyes off the screen. As well as the action aspects are drawn in from Cap's past, which make this more of an emotional film than you'd expect. While the first Avenger was a good setup for the character, the Russo brothers take him in this film and lead him down a path which creates history within this franchise. Coming in at 9th place is Ant-Man. Before you dislike this video, I've heard all you have to say about it, but I still stand by my opinion that this is the most underrated MCU film, and it's definitely one of the funniest. It's a mixture with comedy and a heist plot, and the cast's chemistry just makes it such an enjoyable ride. You know, Paul Rudd, my favourite actor, Michael Pena, even Michael Douglas gets in on the humour at times. The film has a bright flair, which is obvious where you can tell Edgar Wright worked on the script. If only he was fully involved with it all the way to the end, we may have seen an even better film. But the leads are enjoyable, the side cast are very strong and hold up on their own. The shrinking text allowed for some unique action sequences where it cleverly combines his size with the environment he's in. I'm talking about that Thomas the Tank Engine scene at the end, which had me laughing out loud in cinema. Darren Cross is an insanely exaggerated villain and probably the weakest point of this film, but it doesn't really get in the way that much as everything else around it is just so fun. Evangeline Lilly's Hope had an interesting story attached to her, but even her character can get a bit annoying at times as she just constantly keeps moaning. But an extremely underrated MCU movie and a great comedy in general, as it doesn't really need to be amongst the MCU. It certainly has its moments, but if anyone's just looking for a comedy, you can chuck this one on. Coming in at 8th place is Thor Ragnarok. Out of the 3 big Avengers, Thor's movies had been by far the weakest. His first 2 weren't really up to par of any of Iron Man or Captain America's movies, so expectations were low coming into this film, but Taika Waititi managed to inject a huge amount of fun into it without it feeling too out of place. He managed to combine great humour with this depiction of destiny all into one tone, which manages to somehow work and make this Thor's best outing by far. Chris Hemsworth thrives in this character change and making him a huge improvement over past adaptations. Cate Blanchett made for a strong female villain, something the MCU had been lacking up until this point, and you get the best brother arc in Loki and Thor throughout this film, of course contained with a lot of humour. This film is a blast from start to finish. It is hilarious, it has a great story, and it doesn't really disappoint in any areas. Coming in at 7th place is Spider-Man Homecoming. This film is an unfamiliar telling of Spider-Man. It doesn't contain an origin story, it doesn't contain Uncle Ben dying. They just pick up where he was introduced in Captain America Civil War and go from there. As the title suggests, we get more of a focus of Peter Parker in high school, showing what it's really like to have a teenage superhero in the MCU and how he juggles his responsibilities. As well as Tom Holland's highly energetic performance, a new aspect of a Spider-Man movie is the introduction of his best friend Ned, who's played hilariously by Jacob Batalon. Michael Keaton returning to the superhero genre this time as a villain was a great decision, as Vulture is one of the top MCU villains, definitely top 3 in my opinion. And the simple reason is just because he's menacing and he doesn't have this plot to take over the whole world just to help his family out. A combination of high school drama, comedy, action, and adventure, and of course it being a superhero movie makes Spider-Man Homecoming fun reboot and just a fun movie in general. Coming in at 6th place is Guardians of the Galaxy. Upon its announcement, Guardians of the Galaxy seemed like a bad idea since it was very early into the MCU and was a huge risk. No one had heard of the source material. When looking into that source material, you know, you had a talking tree, a talking raccoon, you had a former WWE wrestler, you had the fat guy from Parks and Recs. However, Marvel's big risk paid off and perhaps changed the MCU, allowing them to be more adventurous with their films. The absurdity of all the elements factor into making one of the best, unique, and hilarious films in this franchise. Expectations were low, but the contagious humor and great character chemistry from James Gunn's films made this one of the best entries into the franchise. Not that it's bad, but the plot is one of the weaker parts of the entire movie, but only because everything else is so strong that not that it's necessarily bad. It's, you know, what you'd want from this film, a nice simple origin story, and it executes in doing that, making this one of the biggest surprises of the MCU. Coming in at 5th place is Iron Man, the one to kick off this entire universe. It certainly does get better with every rewatch because it doesn't have the responsibility of having to tie into all the other films. It's a good starting point and it's executed phenomenally. Robert Downey Jr.'s career-saving performance as Tony Stark cemented him as the perfect casting for this character, and from then on led a franchise forward. He has such a great charisma that even when he is arrogant, cocky, and really selfish, he is still always likable and enjoyable to see on screen. Coming off the back of the Raimi trilogy X-Men movies, Iron Man continues with the super serious superhero content, executing all the cheesiness from prior films. Due to the compelling story and characters, you don't really notice the lack of actions. When we did eventually have those action scenes, they would always be captivating. The MCU has seen better days when it comes to final battles, but you know, it's their first outing, they were still sorting it out, and it's not like it's an embarrassment, it's just not to the standard of the rest of the film, but yet that was a high standard to meet. Coming in at 4th place is the Avengers. After carefully constructing the origins for specific heroes, Marvel had the right to deliver a massive live-action team-up movie, and because we've all had the development for the characters in the previous films, it felt natural and it did not feel rushed at all. The dialogue is one of the more underrated aspects of this film because chucking them all into a room together and watching them have conversations really does create that good chemistry and charisma amongst the actors, and those actors all doing a good job. Even Mark Ruffalo, who's the newcomer to this franchise, taking over from Edward Norton. The film even stuck the landing, and rewatching I was surprised how insane the last battle was, as it took up 40 minutes and never dropped in quality, always giving huge masses of action. So this was a highly ambitious film, but one which really stuck the landing. Now into the top 3 with Captain America Civil War. For all people that questioned what happens to the Avengers after they destroy a city in order to save it, Captain America is the film for you. It shows that the characters are more than just people dressed up with superheroes. They do have feelings and they do have consequences to face. Separated by political views, the Avengers split up in half, and both sets have good reason to. When you have two sets of former allies with characters that you all love, it's hard to root for a single team or character when they did end up fighting, and with that fight you did fear for all of them. There is a lot of emotion packed into this film, and in the end it leads to being the main orchestra of the final battle, which is thanks to the villain Zemo, who is one of the more interesting villains because, as I said, he's not powerful, he doesn't have any special abilities, he's just using the emotion of the Avengers to turn them on each other. So it makes for a very satisfying film and one which was very emotional. Coming in at 2nd place is Avengers Infinity War. This is perhaps the biggest superhero team-up movie of all time in terms of sheer size and execution. We've had solo movies for Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and seen them team up in the Avengers. This far down the line we have, you know, Doctor Strange meeting Tony Stark, the Guardians of the Galaxy meeting Thor. It was such a surreal experience, and one which as soon as it happened you knew was going to be an epic adventure. The villain they're facing is the biggest foe that we've witnessed in the MCU thus far in Thanos, and he is such a menacing figure and extremely powerful with the plan he is trying to execute. We can see he does have emotion about him, but he's willing to do whatever is necessary to complete his goal, which he eventually does do, and he pulls off one of the most shocking twists in recent years by killing off half of the universe, including half of the Avengers. Infinity War had a huge climax as well as a huge execution all around, but that was a truly shocking moment which set up things for a huge finale in first place. That huge finale being my number one pick, Avengers Endgame, which is my favourite film of all time. Given the amount of emotion this film provoked from me, I saw this at the midnight premiere and it was one of the best experiences of my life. As mentioned, Infinity War ended on a huge cliffhanger and you're wondering how things would be reversed in this film, and it tackles time travel, which we hadn't really experienced before in this franchise, and in doing so opened up for a lot of fan service to be had. And maybe people think this is just a glorified film with a load of fan service which covers up its mistakes, but I don't think so. I think everything is earned from all the previous 22 films or however many they had, setting up everything to happen. We see a new look to our characters where they're completely broken following on the events that Thanos has caused. To some, the 3-hour runtime may be a bit excessive, but to me, I could have done with another 3 hours on top of that. I had such an enjoyable time, the time flew by, and it all sets up for an insane climax with high emotions, some of the best action ever put to screen, and a huge ensemble cast pulling in characters from the start of the MCU. So no doubt this was my number one pick, as it's a superb superhero movie, superb MCU movie, and in general just a superb movie. So that was my ranking of my favourite franchise of all time, and I completely forgot what the whole reason I made this video was for the Eternals, because that seems like I talked about that so long ago and I've been caught up in reliving the MCU since then. But anyways, let me know what your ranking is down below. I'm sure it will be very different to mine given the sheer amount of movies within this franchise, and oh dear, it's only going to get bigger from now on, so please like and subscribe, it'd really mean a lot, because these videos, the ones which have 20 plus films, and within a couple of months time this will have 30 films, it's a really long process to film, to edit especially, and even watch the films and write my notes, so I'd really appreciate if you like and subscribe. It's the best way to support me. But anyways, I really hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope to see you in my next one.